Hi, this is Delegate Steve Aarons, District 36, representing Kent, Queen Anne, Cecil, and Caroline counties, and you're listening to the Maryland Association of Counties podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Conduit Street Podcast. This is Dom Butchko, and you are listening to a very special Earth Week episode. Today we have with us two superstar guests from the Maryland League of Conservation Voters, Kristen Harbeson.
Hi.
And Rebecca Rehr.
Hey, Dom. Great to be here.
Great to have you. Now, for those of you who don't know, the Maryland League of Conservation Voters, or Maryland LCV, is one of the most respected and active environmental voices in Annapolis. I had the pleasure of working with both of you on a number of issues this past session, and Kristen, you and I in particular were in the trenches together on a number of things. Kristen, I want to start with you. You know, you're really an Annapolis veteran with a ton of experience walking the halls of our General Assembly. Can you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself and your journey to Maryland LCV?
Yeah, sure. I actually started my actual education is in museum education and history, but I moved through various job transitions. I really learned that I enjoyed the public engagement and advocacy and working with elected officials. So first with museums and then with historic preservation, and then I got a job with Chairman Maggie McIntosh as her chief of staff for 5 years. First for 4 years with Environmental Matters, the committee that's now Environment and Transportation, and then followed her for a year to Appropriations. And then this job came up and it seemed like a natural fit. So that's a short version of how I got this job. And I have been here for 9 years and I just love it.
Awesome. And Rebecca, what about you? Tell us a little bit about your background and your journey into environmental advocacy.
Yeah, thanks. Unlike Kristen, I think I have I think it's a little unusual, a very linear path to where I am today, which is there was lead in the pipes in my high school. And, I went to school in Baltimore. I grew up in Baltimore. And when I was in high school at Poly, they put up signs, don't drink the water. And it was because there was lead in the pipes. And so that was my first introduction to how environmental exposure can impact your health and understanding being able to see environmental injustice before I had sort of the formal terms for it. And then through my education, did an undergrad in environmental policy, graduate work in public health. I knew I wanted to go into policy, but I wanted to have the grounding in science. And I thought that public health was really the way to reach people on environmental issues. Because when you talk about, breathing clean air and drinking clean water, that's something that resonates with people in their everyday lives. And you can talk about the way that climate change is impacting our health. And it really reaches people where they are in their lives. And so that's sort of how I see the world is through that public health lens. And why I work in environmental policy is because I believe that climate policy, when it is just, can build health equity. So I did a fellowship at EPA. I worked in Maryland previously. And then I was the director of the Climate for Health program at EcoAmerica, where I worked with large health organizations to build their climate programs. And then Kristen actually said, hey, there's a job opening for the director of climate policy and justice at Maryland LCV, which is an organization I work for and love, and you should apply because I would love to work with you. So thank you, Kristen. And I have been here a little over 2 years and absolutely love it.
Awesome. I love that journey. I have to say, I like the perspective that you bring. When we say we want to clean the bay, some of this stuff is kind of like high out there ideas that you might not be able to touch. But when you're talking about breathing clean air, not making sure there's not lead in your water, that's very, very real stuff. And we don't think about that in the environmental space, but it really is important. So very cool. Now, for everyone's benefit, Kristen and Rebecca, can you tell us a little bit about your organization, Maryland LCV, your history, your mission? For those of us in Annapolis, we all know that you're one of the most respected, as I said before, environmental groups in town, and on a whole host of issues, because the environmental space is pretty big. But for those who aren't familiar with your organization, can you provide a little bit more color?
Sure. Maryland LCV has been, this is Kristen Wills, and I can start and Rebecca can fill in, but we started about 40 years ago. We were founded in 1979. Our tagline has been basically from the beginning that we're the political voice for the environment. We are, and as we've evolved over the years, we started as all volunteer, hired an executive director, expanded the team slowly over the years. When I started in 2015, we were fully staffed with 6 people. Today, we are fully staffed with 12. So we've doubled, and a lot of that has happened in the last few years as we've refocused our organization to really focus on the intersection between climate change and environmental justice. And that nexus and that refocus is really when we decided, or as an organization, that we needed a director of climate policy and justice, and hired Rebecca, who I absolutely knew was the right person for the job. But we do work at a whole host of issues, wanting to ground everything in issues of climate change and environmental justice. And if it's not, because both of those big topics touch everything, whether you're talking about water policy, sea level rise and climate change. We have Marissa Olszewski is our director of environmental policy manager, and she deals with land use and forests and water and the bay, and works at the coalition of the Clean Water Coalition to really deal with issues of water protection and making sure that our water is safe for everything, for all of the uses that we use it for, whether it's recreational or health and drinking and everything else. Agriculture. We've also expanded in terms of looking at really trying to recognize that Maryland is a very diverse state, and that one of the groups that is the most impacted by issues of climate change and environmental justice is the Latino community. And so just before actually I started, about 10 years ago, we started our CHISPA program. CHISPA is Spark in Spanish. And that was really a effort to engage and organize and work with specifically the Latino community in Maryland. Starting in Prince George's County, Montgomery County, we've expanded to more, to include also Baltimore City, Baltimore County. And that's a place where it's really local. So it's working with jurisdictions, with the counties to build out that strength. So, but we focus on legislation, like you and I work in a legislative year. I am a legislative person primarily. But then through the rest of the year, we do other work. We do a scorecard. We're the accountability people. We do a scorecard every year for the General Assembly. Every single member of the General Assembly has a score about how they did in their environmental scores this year. We asked them to vote on things. How did they do? Every 2 years, we look at the governor's race, the governor's office, and assess them. We do get involved in politics. We work in elections. We work to endorse candidates. We work to support the candidates that we've endorsed. So it's both through a C3 and a C4 arm. So we really look at this whole cycle of accountability and developing a partnership with the General Assembly and all those folks. And then also working then obviously with the communities to help them engage with communities. So that was a lot, but there you have it.
Yeah, you are everywhere. LCV is empire building. I mean, I
That's
love
what
it.
I try.
for a better environment. Now, can one of you talk a little bit more about your organization's priorities and, specifically priorities that impact local governments? Counties, we really are the boots on the ground level of government closest to the people. And we're the first line of defense when it comes to conservation, preservation, climate change, and a whole host of other issues that both of our members care about. I feel like there's a lot of synergy between our missions and organizations. So can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, I can. This is Rebecca. I can jump in here. I also will say, to support all of the great work that Kristen mentioned, we also throw a great party. And I will say that on September 26th in College Park, we're going to have our annual Changemakers event. And so everybody listening right now, this is your official invitation to join us. And you can check out more information on our website, mdlcv.org. But I hope you join us on September 26th to learn more about what we're doing and to join us in this work. And so and you'll hear about our priorities at that event, right? And I'm going to talk about two. Kristen really talked about the focusing of our work on climate change and environmental justice. So I'm going to talk about two things right now. One is to address climate change, working on 100% clean energy by 2035. And that is actually, our Governor Moore ran on that platform, promising 100% clean energy in our state by 2035. And we are very supportive of that goal. And we are working toward, you saw a lot of our priorities in 2024 reflect that journey, that were the work that we have to do to get there. And you're going to see more of that from us. And that's supporting our offshore wind work, supporting the expansion of solar, making sure that a transition to clean energy is just. And that when we talk about clean energy and we talk about the jobs available, that it's a really there's intentional work to increase opportunity for generational wealth building. Because we're talking about job creation. And when we talk about job creation in a new industry, we have to talk about ways that folks have been excluded from those opportunities in the past and ways to correct that injustice through new industry and opportunity. And so when we talk about clean energy, that's what we're talking about. And we're working on and building a campaign towards that. And you will see more of that in the 2025 session. And I know we're still recovering from the last one, but it's sort of never too early to talk about one of the reasons we work on policy in our work on environmental justice and climate is because policy is a way to enact systemic change. We need to work locally. We need to have community-driven work, particularly on environmental justice, and that must lead to systemic change at the policy level, which is why one of the reasons we're so focused on policy. That's our 100% clean work and figuring out sort of what are the policy mechanisms that need to change? What are the financing mechanisms? We did not see, frankly, enough in terms of the policy change on investing in clean energy and our climate plan that we would have liked to see this session. And so what are the financing mechanisms that we're going to put in place to support clean energy? So that's our 100% clean work. Lots more to come on that, trust me. And I wanted to talk a little bit about the tools we have. I think you heard from Kristen earlier about our accountability tools. We also have a lot of educational tools in our tool belt that is ever expanding at Maryland LCV. In 2022, when we passed the Climate Solutions Now Act, the big climate bill that puts in place our greenhouse gas emission reduction goals and several other big picture climate goals. What it also did was define in statute definitions of overburdened communities and underserved communities. And the reason it got so specific is so that a lack of specificity could no longer be a reason for inaction. I think when people hear environmental justice, there's sort of, and this is because of decades of work and advocacy, but there's an inherent sense, an inherent understanding of what that means. There's a history of segregation, a history of discrimination that has resulted today in communities of color in low-income communities living closer to sources of pollution. And I'll take just as an aside, again, sort of from that public health perspective, we saw that come to bear during the COVID pandemic when folks are more susceptible to respiratory illness when they're already exposed to respiratory triggers like air pollution. So your lungs are more vulnerable when you live near a highway or a diesel truck, a diesel truck route, or a fossil fuel generating facility, because your lungs are repeatedly assaulted by air pollution. It then makes you more vulnerable to additional threats like respiratory illness, like COVID. And so we see that's that intersection of public health and environmental exposure that's critical to the way that we're going to build a future, to our vision, Maryland LCV's vision of a healthy environment for everyone, is so that we can improve health and well-being, right? So back to the definitions. We have these definitions of overburdened and underserved. Underserved is referencing low income, limited English proficiency, and non-white. And those indicators are indicative of access to resources. And then the definition of overburden, it's a little more complex, but it's basically runs down a litany of indicators having to do with health and environmental exposure. And if your census tract is in the 75th percentile in the state for 3 or more of those indicators, then your census tract is considered overburdened. And the MDE, the Maryland Department of the Environment, has an EJ screening tool. So the map, and you can see overburdened and underserved right there on the map. You can see percentiles. You can see if your census tract is, a high overburdened, high underserved. And Maryland LCV also, with MACo in mind, has a set of maps per county that is available on our website.
Oh, shucks, you shouldn't have. Well, thanks.
Because we value the decision-making power that happens at the county level and the investment that happens at the county level. When we talk about local health departments, when we talk about the ways to target federal dollars at the local level to build environmental justice. So I feel like I'm talking a lot. So I'm gonna pause and just say those maps are available. Maps has really transformed the way that we can visualize injustice so that we can build justice. And those tools are available on the state level. And we at Maryland LCV have tried to just sort of supplement the tools that MDE has so that we can help decision makers at the state and local level bring in those federal dollars, allocate them, and engage community in what needs to happen next in building towards environmental justice.
And so I will just say really quick for our listeners, we will plan on having some webinars in conjunction with Maryland LCV on some of the tools that we just talked about and a few more that we haven't gotten to yet. So if you're sitting here excited saying, I want to jump in, don't worry, your opportunity is coming. So I really want to get into some detail about solar siting. Now,
I'm shocked.
Yeah. Buckle up if you weren't already. The podcast is about to get real good. So, Kristen, you are like one of the go-to people in Annapolis on renewable energy, on solar siting in particular. First, can you just kind of give me what's your view of the rundown of the current situation, both like the most recent legislative session and just the past 2 years? Because I know you've been very active in this space.
Yeah, one of the things my checkered past has led me to is working in different fields. The museum field, the historic preservation field gave me a grounding in land use policy and land use issues, right? So looking at things like heritage areas and view sheds and sort of character and value of character of a place. And the importance of place as in terms of the character of a community and people's investment in that community, what makes us, right? So that was something that I've had for a long time. And then moving into the environmental space, looking at renewable energy, we're having, that's all of a sudden we have a climate crisis that is not up for debate. And one of the ways we can address the climate crisis is through advancing renewable energy. We have to do it. Maryland has been a leader in this. We passed even before the Climate Solutions Now Act, we passed the Clean Energy Jobs Act, which mandated that we will have 50% renewable energy by the year 2030, and that 14.5% of our energy will come from solar. We are a little bitty state with really big goals, and those goals are multifaceted. And in terms of we have that goal for where we're for solar energy, we also have to protect our agriculture. We also want to plant more forests. We also want to protect our water quality. So all of these things requires space. And so the real challenge has been figuring out how to balance all those things. And the tension has been between as you know, you and I worked on this ad nauseum. I think we talked 2, 3, 4 times a day sometimes, trying to go through work through some of these issues for months, is trying to figure out how you strike the balance between encouraging solar development, but also protecting what makes a community a community. The values that come from living in a rural area. What does that mean? And how can we balance? How can we find a space, physical space, for all these goals that we have? And so it's where energy policy and land use policy collide. And I think the people who work in land use policy don't understand energy policy. And I think the people who work in energy policy don't necessarily understand land use policy. And I'm not sure that I know either one of them to the degree that I should, but I know where the intersection is, and I can see both pieces of it. And so that's one of the reasons that I really have worked so hard on that issue, because it is so complicated and it requires everybody coming together to work towards a solution, because it is so personal. Nothing is more personal to somebody than where they live.
Exactly. Yeah. One of the biggest things for a county is being able to kind of shape the look, smell, and feel of the places that we call home. I want to say, and Kristen, I think you'll agree with me on this, one of the inherent tensions of some of Maryland's policy, especially related to kind of solar and land use, is we've spent hundreds of millions of dollars over the past several decades on conservation. And now the most affordable place, or the most, not necessarily affordable, but economical place to build, a big solar installation is on those areas that we want to conserve, because they're flat and they're not well built. I mean, this is a tension that we saw on several bills that came up this year. I think there was one bill that said that, each jurisdiction would have to develop solar based on kind of the entire energy load that they have. That being said, in Baltimore County or Baltimore City, for example, when you're an entirely built up urban environment, you're probably not going to be able to generate that much solar. So it's a very interesting back and forth. I mean, we talk about economics, both the economics of the farmer, but then what does that mean for the community? If it is on ag land, what does this, urban solar landscape look like? Part of the big solar bill that we just passed, Brighter Tomorrow, I mean, there were incentives for rooftop solar there. And I also think an interesting part of the conversation, so there was an article today in the Washington Post, and it was talking about solar in California. And this is something that I'm not aware of this, but it's a new trend where when you have solar, you can generate during the day, but your peak energy times are right in the morning and right in the evening. And so, in California, middle of the day, when you're generating the most solar, they actually had, several, I want to say 2 million megawatts, but we can drop the article and you can double check me on that. But there was a lot of solar energy that they were just kind of wasting. And so if we're seeing that happen in another state, how do we also take that into play too? Because, do we use battery technology and there's issues around that. MACo also had a battery safety bill. Quick plug for that one. Thank you, Delegate Love and Senator Gallion there. But yeah, this is a really big issue, and I think it's one that we're going to talk about for some time.
Oh yeah, no, we worked to try very hard to get a bill that would a comprehensive look to try to really crack the nut of solar siting for this legislative session, and that we didn't. So, but what we did do was there was the Brighter Tomorrow Act, sponsored by Senator Sarah Elfreth and Delegate David Frazier-Hidalgo, that was specifically focused on incentives. And the idea is, as you said, it is cheaper and easier to build solar on open space, on land that's not already built up. And so how do we incentivize? And so that has increased the pressure on, there are lots of pressures, as anybody who spends any time with any kind of agriculture, like there's lots of pressures on it. Solar is just one of the pressures on ag land. There's also pressure to develop. There's land is sold for residential and corporate development. Like there's lots of different pressures. We're losing farmland to a lot of different things, and solar is just is one of them. And there's the tension is, well, you can have solar and ag land at the same time. You can put them together. They don't have to take. If you put it, the question is, so if you put solar on it, you can return it to agricultural use at a later point. and there's questions about, well, how do you make sure that that's true? How do you protect the soil underneath it? How do you do what you need to do so that that can be true? But it doesn't, but then it, and that, so that is the truth about the, the physical nature of being able to protect the soil and have solar at the same time. But that doesn't get into the question of that people don't like the look of solar. And that becomes, a harder question because, well, yeah, but aesthetics can't be regulated. Well,
not with that attitude, they can't. No, I'm kidding.
Well,
kidding.
I mean,
Everyone listening,
what I find I think solar fields are, I find them interesting to look at. I don't mind them. I think that they're pretty. Other people don't. Is my point of view any different than the point of view of the people there? Well, maybe I don't live there next to them, but so those those questions become really personal. But one of the things is we want to de-escalate the pressure on open space to put it to where we actually want the solar, which is closer to where people live. And that we want that both because it's, get more CODA benefits when you can have solar canopies, right? Everybody wants solar canopies. They're really expensive. They're hard to build. How do we bring down that cost by creating incentives to allow that to happen? The closer the energy that's being produced is to the people who use it, the less transmission cost there is. It's better to have the energy being produced closer to where people live. So, and that is built up areas, obviously. So how do we do that? You can put lots of solar in Baltimore City, but it's hard because you need to reinforce roofs. Mm-hmm. Not every, right? So there's a lot of different complicated issues. The Brighter Tomorrow Act tried to get at some of that. It's one step forward. We still need to get to the issue of solar siting and the utility scale solar. The Brighter Tomorrow Act didn't talk about any of those utility scale solars at all. Anything ground mount, the ground mount being the ones that are on open space, right? Except in a very small space, right? So that is still something we need to work on. And so you and I are going to be working on this. Moving forward, I'm sorry you're going to have to keep suffering through me because I can't get rid of this issue. This issue.
I never suffer through you, Kristen.
But this is an issue we really have to address because we cannot meet the goals that we have established, any of them. The agricultural preservation goals, the forest conservation goals, the solar expansion goals. We can't meet any of those if we don't address where we put them. Now there's the data centers, pressure for data centers, like we're going to put those in. That's also going to be, those are big buildings. Where are those going to be? Some of them might be in places where there are, the Alcoa site in Frederick is already developed. That's a great place for it. But that's not what happened in Virginia. In Virginia, they took probably previous farmland and put data centers in and made it industrial, right? So how do we deal with this? How do we look at land use? We are a small state with big goals. How do we fit everything together?
Yeah, I want to touch on a few points that you brought up because they kept coming up in our conversations. And, Kristen said this, but, we did not have a compromised solar land use bill this year. I'm very confident that we will.
You're also competent.
Depending on the day. We'll see if we get a bill. But to go back, there are a few points that I kind of want to delve into a little bit for our listeners. So first on the soil, I think one thing that struck me back and forth between the conservation community and a few others was the competing information around the soil. And it really is project specific, soil specific, and kind of what our timeline is. Because there were a few folks that I thought had a really good point saying, if we're going to invest all this money into a big solar installation, in 30 years when that lease is up, you're more than likely going to renew that lease. You're not going to decommission that solar installation. And even if you are, packing the soil. So we talk about agriculture and solar. Are we talking agrivoltaics where you kind of have both, or are we talking about taking a certain section of the farm, cordoning that off? So I think the soil, I don't have an answer to any of this, but I think the soil question is really big. And a part of that too is, our prime and productive soils and our different classes of soils and how we want to treat those. If you look at a map across Maryland, when you say, we have type 1 or whatever the correct terminology is, it's not in a neat little box over here. It's spread out and kind of dispersed. And if you look at a map of a farm and the soil types, I mean, you might have the house on the most prime part, and then the part that you're actually using for agriculture, might not be the best type of soil. And I think that those are really big questions that we started to scratch the surface on. And I think our listeners can kind of get a feel for how complex it is. Additionally, you talked about the look. And I think this is a really kind of interesting conversation, because why do you move to a rural community? You were either born there or you moved there because you want to, have that look, smell, and feel of that area. And so when we talk about look, I think that in the view, there does have to be a middle ground. I think anyone saying like a 10-mile setback, that's a lot. But making sure that there's hedges so that, you're not getting glare, and making sure that you're built at a certain angle so, you don't get the reflection on the oncoming cars. I think that there's a really good middle ground that we can find there. I mean, one of my planners, and we just had the big housing bill this past year. And so one of my planning folks had this great saying where you can't regulate taste. And so we were talking about different elements of it. And you're right, you can't regulate the look. But I think there are certain things, certain livability factors where we can kind of find a middle ground.
Right.
The other side of this, I think we have to talk about storage too.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, we need to figure, the technology is still growing. The technology is still coming. We also have a storage goal. We also have a storage goal of 3,000 megawatts of storage by 2030. We're nowhere close to that either, right? These are all part of it. They're part and parcel, because as you mentioned, the California, they're using all this. Like, we need to be able to have reserves of the energy so we can have a reliable grid. In addition to all the issues that you brought up in terms of where the conflict was, yes, about the soil and about everything, it's people want to be able, it's like farmers want to be able to put solar on. They want to be able to have that diversified income stream from leasing their land for solar. But then people are saying, well, you can't do that because I don't like the look of it, right? Or because wants it to be able to keep the rest of their farm in productive land because they need that diversified income stream, because farming is hard and expensive and unpredictable, especially with climate change and increased variability in the weather patterns, right? They need to have some, and solar energy is a predictable income stream. That lease is a predictable income stream. So how do you balance the need of the broader community with the need of the farmer and the land use rights, right? But there are always going to be restrictions of what people can do with their own property. The thing I think, and you heard me say this many, many times, everybody's going to have to give on this. Everybody. The solar industry is going to have to give some of what they have stood with, what the guarantees that they have, in order to find, and the counties are going to have to give too. Everybody's going to have to get used to the idea of being uncomfortable, because change is hard, and there are too many places where people are just dug in. And if everybody's dug in, then nobody's going to be able to you're never going to be able to find that middle ground if you're not able to leave the foxhole that you're entrenched in. Everybody's going to have to get used to being uncomfortable.
Well, I just love how the tenor of your words.
I am dug in on the need to be uncomfortable.
Well, no, we're talking foxholes and we're talking trenches and we're beating each other up in these solar conversations.
But tell me that I'm wrong. Tell me that's not how it feels. Depending on the day, that's how the solar industry feels. They feel like they're under attack. The farmers feel like they're under attack. The counties feel like they're under attack. That's how it feels. You get into these conversations and it feels like people are dug in. It does feel like it's a battle. They feel like they are under attack. And so if you need to step away from that, so getting people to to say, PACs, right? Let's just stop and think about this and understand everybody has a perspective that's important, and everybody understands that everybody's going to have to give in order to find that middle ground.
Which is also why it's so important we're having this conversation today and continue the conversation throughout the year, because sometimes what happens is, like, these conversations have to, the big picture conversations, getting everyone at the table has to happen now and has to be ongoing. Because if you just have these conversations during the session, like what we are talking about right now is talking about transforming our energy system. We are talking about transformational change. And this session, I think we can all attest to, is quite a transactional environment. And so if you're trying to make transformational change in only a transactional environment, it's going to fall short somewhere. And so if we can have these conversations now, if we can bring everybody to the table, then it's a way to listen, you're not starting at ground zero, right? These conversations have been going on, as you both attested to, for a long time. And so getting to the solutions, getting to these points of compromise early is the way to have then successful, I think, legislative conversations. And storage has to be part of the conversation. Yes. And siting of storage, because they're not, I think everybody should take a field trip to a storage facility, because I think we think of our Duracell batteries like, oh, I can put my battery in my remote. That's not the scale we're talking about when we talk about building batteries that are going to store megawatts of energy that we can, Dom, to your point earlier, soak up the sun in the middle of the day and then use it at night at these peak times. The DRIVE Act is another bill that passed this year to be able to look at, can we have incentives for using energy at different times of day? Because, in a way that's protective of people who, for example, are on oxygen, need electricity, can't choose when they use their electricity. They need it for health reasons and other reasons. So can we also create incentives to use energy at off-peak times? So that, we got to look at everything, sort of an all of the above approach here. So yes, storage, yes, looking at trying to incentivize people to using energy different times of day, changing behavior, incentivizing good behavior, making the good choice, the healthy choice, the easy choice. And that's all and Kristen is right. Change is hard. And we need to leave space for people to grieve for for things that they're giving up.
And also think about creative solutions. Like another bill that passed a couple of years ago that was a partnership with the utilities and with the electric school buses, because what else is not often used during the middle of the day or in the hottest parts of the summer? School buses, right? School buses are big. They've got giant batteries. If you have an electric school bus it becomes a battery. It becomes a battery that can be in reserve, and you can have a system where it can charge, and that it can collect, it can hold the charge, and then provide grid stability when they need to. And buses are movable, obviously. So if you need more power someplace, there are possibilities. You could have a whole movable battery system, emergency backup, but you have to have the technology, you have to have the innovation to be able to get that. And I think one of the things that we need to look at are ways that we can think of solutions like that, incentivize new technology, new innovation.
And the Public Service Commission has an active work group right now on the state's storage program and proceedings on the electric school bus pilot program as well. So lots of opportunities to get involved and support.
So clearly this is going to be a big issue, and we are going to be best friends for at least another.
You had no idea what you were getting into when you invited us to be on this podcast.
Oh my God. All right, if I can transition now to our last topic, I wanted to talk about challenges and kind of future areas of collaboration outside of solar. Clearly, we're going to be arm in arm on this one. I think no one, either of you nor our listeners will be surprised that climate change is going to be a really big issue for Maryland. Last week, we did an entire episode dedicated to water, and we went into some depth on issues like sea level rise and PFAS. Also, phenomenal episode. So if you didn't listen to it, be sure to go back. What challenges is Maryland LCV looking at? And in your view, are areas that maybe we can get a little MACo LCV Dream Team action collaboration going on for next session?
I mean, I think that we can agree on everything. I don't know what you're talking about. I go into everything assuming that we're all going to be getting along.
Big old bear hugs.
I'm interested in Rebecca's thoughts. I think that the idea, looking at sea level rise and the vulnerable communities, and how we can support the communities that are suffering from, that are most impacted by sea level rise, and taking a look at how to manage that, how to manage those communities. Some of them are, some of the you think of the sea level, the beachfront communities as being wealthy, but a lot of them aren't. A lot of them are the historically Black communities, especially on the Eastern Shore and Southern Maryland. Like, there are a lot of places that don't have the resources and are really suffering with sea level rise. But how do you balance that? How do we support those communities to make sure that they are protected and have the resources they need? The comprehensive flood management plan has a bigger goal on that. Like, it's looking at sort of plans for it and making sure that those under-resourced communities have additional funding for it. But that's not an immediate, that's not an emergency response issue. So how do we deal with that? I think that we can absolutely work together on that.
Yeah, I agree. And it's worth mentioning, we're on this special Earth Week podcast. And I think for us, like Earth Day is like our Christmas, because everybody's, we work on this issue all day, every day. And Earth Day is like, oh, everybody can pay attention for 24 hours. And this is awesome. Right. And it's sort of like, it's a great opportunity for education. And it's, there are opportunities like that throughout the year. Tomorrow is Arbor Day. So there's great opportunities for tree planting, and I think that's another area, to work together on. But really, I think what we can work together on is making those connections so that people see the way that climate change and sea level rise are impacting their lives today. I think for a long time, it's becoming less true because impacts are more severe and frequent. But people were saying, yeah, climate change, that's a far away issue, both in space and time. And if we can work together to help people understand the way that climate change is impacting, not just the shorelines. And by the way, Maryland is 12,407 square miles. Not that I looked it up right before this podcast, but it has 3,000 miles of shoreline. And it's more than that if you actually look at some of the marsh areas and things like that, but it's 3,190 miles of shoreline. And so that's a big
250,000 acres that are less than 5 feet above sea level.
It's a lot of space that is vulnerable to sea level rise. And it's a lot of people who live there. And so how can we work together on making sure that, that information and that, like, the scariness of climate change doesn't freak people out towards inaction, but rather spurs people to action. And that's and we're at a time where there are resources to help support action. And so we can't not take advantage of this time to partner on education and on action. Maryland had its first locally acquired case of malaria in more than 40 years last year. We're going to see the spread of vector-borne illness, and it's going to be up to the county health departments to educate folks in the counties on warning signs on don't let there be standing water after there are more frequent and severe, rain events. And there are ways to you get little pellets and you put it in the water and kills the mosquito eggs, and that can prevent disease. And so those are the opportunities that we have to work together and reach people where they are and talk to people about the effects, not in a polarizing way, not in a political way, not in a way that's meant to freak you out, but that's in a way to talk about these issues in a way that can understand what we can do about them today. And I'll just mention, we've talked a lot about sea level rise and about people vulnerable to sea level rise. I sit on the Maryland Commission on Environmental Justice and Sustainable Communities, which, by the way, our meetings are open to the public and always public comment. But our last meeting this week, on Earth Week, we watched a film called Eroding History. And it is all about the residents of Deal Island in Maryland and the work that they're doing to preserve their history as it sinks, as their land is sinking. And it's like a 25 minute film that gives you a lot to think about and talks about history of injustice, talking about sea level rise, and all here in Maryland. And so I do encourage folks to check out that film. It's called Eroding History. And I think it's a good way, and hosting film discussions are a great way to engage people and learn about history and take action. So that's a good one to check out for sure.
Awesome. Well, Kristen and Rebecca, thank you for coming on. I have to say, of all of our Earth Week episodes, this is hands down our best one yet. Before we close, I do need to do a little plug for our upcoming 2024 MACo Summer Conference, #MACoCon. This will be August 14th through the 17th at the Roland Powell Convention Center in Ocean City, Maryland. Registration is opened, and you can find all of our information for our conference on our website on mdcounties.org or in our show notes. Thank you everyone for tuning in to this very special episode of the Conduit Street Pod. As always, if you enjoyed the podcast, please like and subscribe. That way you can get all of the episodes like this delivered directly to the device of your choice. Also, please feel free to send us a 5-star review, whether you like the show or not. You can also follow along on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and of course, the one and only Conduit Street blog. So for Kristen and Rebecca, this is Dom Butchko signing off, and we will talk to you soon.